Welcome. I'm Victor Curran, and on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, I would like to welcome you this evening. Our group, for more than 16 years, we have been putting on programs like this. Is that a question already? I see a hand up back there. You can't hear me. How about now? All right, that's better. For more than 16 years, we have been putting on programs like this that educate and celebrate the men and women that made Concord the home of American independence and imagination. Tonight we are delighted to welcome back Richard Smith. Many of you have seen him here and elsewhere before. He has been doing public history in Concord for 26 years. He has 13 books out with Applewood Books, and if you don't believe me, you can go look at the table downstairs where you can buy them and get them autographed at the end of the program. Richard has a relationship with First Parish very much like Thoreau's. He's not a member, but he's one of us. So we're very happy. Richard, his public history journey kind of begins with the literary history of Concord, but has expanded into the military history of Concord and the Revolution, the Civil War, into Concord's role in the anti-slavery movement, and now kind of into the social history of Concord, and that's what brings us to tonight's topic, the Hoar family of Concord. So before I turn it over to Richard, I do want to mention a couple of housekeeping things. There will be a reception at the end of the program. The reception is downstairs in the parish hall. To your left, there are stairs. Also, if you go through that door on your left and immediately turn right, there is an elevator that will also take you downstairs. So we're going to have some light refreshments, and we're going to have books for sale and signing. And there will be Q&A. If you have a question and you're watching on Zoom, please put your question in the chat. If you have a question and you're here, just put up your hand. Wait for me to bring the microphone around to you before you ask the question. That way people out in cyberspace can hear it. And I think that's all the business that we have to take care of. So please welcome Richard Smith.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you so much for having me, the Transcendentalism Council. The first time I spoke from this pulpit, I was dressed as Henry Thoreau. And it was in 2019, and I did Plea for John Brown here. And I had 3 people walk out. So it was a successful lecture. The reason I'm doing this talk is for a couple of reasons. The main one is this year marks the 200th anniversary of the birth of George Frisbee Hoar, who we're going to be talking about later. And so rather than just doing a long talk about him, Victor and I talked about maybe throwing in some of the other family members as well. How many Hoar descendants are here tonight? Thank you so much for inviting us to your family reunion. We really appreciate it. I'm going to cover some of the more famous ones. I'm going to be talking, I could talk for hours about any one of these people that I'm going to be talking about tonight, but I'm going to try to give snapshots of some of them, and we might even get into some Concord gossip, which you have to do. So let's get started. First slide, please. From almost the very beginning of Concord in 1635, the Hoar family played an important and prominent role in the town's history, recognized for their leadership in law, politics, and social reform. Their distinguished legal and political careers shaped both local town government and national policy, and they were better known around town and throughout Massachusetts as the Royal Family of Concord. One 19th century writer said of them, quote, "They were in advance of the times in which they lived and were leaders to a higher and better sphere, both in social and political sense." We're going to start with John Hoar. He was born in 1622 in Gloucester, England, the second son of Sheriff Charles Hoar. He was educated in England, and starting in 1632, he apprenticed to his father for almost 10 years. His widowed mother brought him to Massachusetts in or around 1641, and they first settled in Scituate in 1643. In 1659, he moved to Concord and was listed as, quote, a lawyer and a man of property, who lived on what is now Lexington Road in Concord. His home was built sometime after 1650 and later became known as Orchard House. John Hoar was a principled and independent-minded man who spoke his mind regardless of the consequences. Not the first Hoar to do that. He was twice arraigned for not attending church regularly, and was prohibited from practicing law except in his own cases because he spoke slightingly of the town ministers. He began having trouble with the royal authorities in the mid-1660s when he tried to expose what he saw as the judicial corruption of the Massachusetts Bay magistrates. He viewed their judicial actions as biased, self-serving, and abusive of power, specifically regarding their persecution of dissenters and unfair treatment of petitioners. The magistrates used harsh measures, fines, whippings, and imprisonment against anyone with differing religious or political views, which violated Hoar's sense of justice. He petitioned the governor for justice, and he received a hearing in October of 1665. It probably did not surprise him when his complaints were ruled, quote, groundless and unjust, since some of the judges he accused were actually sitting on the court who listened to him. But even Hoar was surprised when they fined him and sentenced him to jail to set an example for any who dared challenge their Puritan authority. Furious, he stormed out of the court. When he was arrested and brought back, his bond was set at 100 pounds. He was disbarred and put in jail. The next spring, Hoar petitioned the court for relief. He was released from jail, his fine was reduced, but his lawyer's standing was not restored. Though he returned to Concord and his family, he was not a man to remain silent. He continued to tell his neighbors exactly what he thought about the magistrates. He was soon back in court, subjected to more fines, and then they demanded a formal apology. When he was released with a warning, he went back to practicing law, and he continued to criticize the authorities. He would not be the last Hoar to come up against the government. In 1675, when Metacom's rebellion started, also known as King Philip's War, Hoar offered to protect a group of friendly Nipmuc praying Indians who lived near Concord. He set aside some of his own property and at his own expense built a palisade for their defense and helped them harvest their food. Some of Hoar's Concord neighbors, frightened by the close proximity of the natives, even though they were friendly, secretly contacted the militia captain Samuel Mosley, a man known for his brutality. I'm looking at Rob Morrison because he recently portrayed him in a little play we did. On a Sunday morning in February, Mosley and his soldiers marched into the Concord meeting house. After worship, he addressed the congregation and announced that he'd heard that there were, quote, some heathens in the town that he believed were upsetting people, and that if they wanted, he could remove them. Now, most of the people said nothing, but one or two people encouraged him to do so. So, over Hoar's vigorous objections, Mosley ordered his soldiers to break down the door of the palisades, seize the Nipmucs, and plundered their food and clothing. The Indians were then marched to Charlestown and then sent to Deer Island, where many of them died. If you do not know, Deer Island is basically the first concentration camp in American history. Because of his actions, John Hoar became known as a man the Indians could trust, and to the Puritans as a man who could be used as a liaison with the native tribes. On February 10th, 1676, Mary Rowlandson, the wife of Lancaster minister Joseph Rowlandson, was taken prisoner with 3 of her children by a band of Nipmuc warriors. Hoar volunteered to the Reverend to act as the colonial representative in the negotiation of their release. He departed Lancaster on April 28, 1676, with 2 native guides, and they met Metacom's war party at Wachusett Lake, located in what is now Princeton, Massachusetts. On May 2nd, after 11 weeks in captivity, Rawlinson and her children were released to Hoar for a 20-pound ransom at the glacial stone outcropping, which we now know today as Redemption Rock. Who's been there? You got to go. John Hoar returned to Concord, and it was said, continued to be a thorn in the side of the authorities. He died on April 2nd, 1704. He was 82 years old. Next slide, please. Samuel Hoar was born on May 18th, 1778 in Lincoln, Massachusetts. He was John Hoar's grandson and the eldest son of Samuel Hoar. He graduated from Harvard College in 1802 and was admitted to the Massachusetts bar in 1805. He was an eminent lawyer and a contemporary and friend of Daniel Webster. Known as Squire Hoar, he regularly served as a Concord town meeting moderator. And as a distinguished lawyer and congressman, he was considered a pillar of the community. He was probably the pillar of the community. A member of the Massachusetts Governor Council, he was both a representative and a senator in the Massachusetts legislature and a representative in the U.S. Congress from 1835 to 1837. A strong advocate of education, temperance, and abolition, Squire Hoar was a Federalist, then a Whig, then a founder of the Free Soil Party, which in 1854 he helped transform into the Republican Party of Massachusetts. In 1812, he married Sarah Sherman, the daughter of Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who was one of the signers of the Declaration, one of the framers of the Constitution, a judge, a United States senator, and the mayor of New Haven. They would have 6 children together. Now, in 1822, South Carolina enacted the Negro Seaman Act, which was enforced up through the 1850s, and it was used to detain free black sailors in local jails while their ships were in port. So basically, any ship going into Charleston or any part in South Carolina, if there was a black sailor, the South Carolinians could seize the black sailors and put them in jail until the ship left. They were afraid that these free black sailors would be a contagion and spread ideas of abolition and freedom to the enslaved peoples of South Carolina. This happened after the Denmark-Vesey slave rebellion in 1822. White leaders in South Carolina believed that free black men from the North and the Caribbean were influencing local enslaved people to revolt. So the law forced the arrest of any free black crew member upon arrival in South Carolina. They would be held until the ship was ready to leave, but the captain had to pay to get them out of jail. If the captain refused to pay, the sailor could then be sold into enslavement. This policy created tension with northern states, obviously, and foreign nations as well, most notably Great Britain, who argued that it violated the rights of their citizens. In November of 1844, Judge Hoar, Squire Hoar, accompanied by his daughter Elizabeth, were commissioned by Massachusetts Governor George Briggs and the Massachusetts legislature to go to South Carolina because Massachusetts black sailors had been stopped on Massachusetts ships that were coming back to Massachusetts and put in jail. So Judge Hoar and Elizabeth went down to try to talk to the South Carolina officials about this. Now, South Carolina legislatures did not take kindly to this meddling from Northerners. And when they learned of Hoar's mission, they told him that he had to get out of town. So this is a quote about what happened. Quote, a mob from Charleston threatened to destroy the hotel where Mr. Hoar was staying. He was urged to leave the city, which he firmly and steadfastly refused to do. a deputation of 70 principal citizens waited upon him at his hotel and requested for him to depart. Friendly residents with Harvard connections tried to persuade him to leave without attempting to address the authorities about the jailed sailors. But Squire Hoar said that, quote, he was too old to run and could not go back to Massachusetts without an attempt to discharge his duty. The committee told him that they had assured the people of Charleston that he should be removed and that he must choose between stepping voluntarily into a carriage and being taken to a ship or being dragged to the ship by force. He then, and not until then, said that he would go. So he and Elizabeth basically left Charleston under this cloud of suspicion and anger. When he got back to Concord on December 27th, he reported this entire story to a Concord town meeting. So the people of Concord were incensed at the South Carolinians' rudeness to their most respected citizen and his daughter. To threaten an emissary from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and to dismiss an issue of law was outrageous behavior. Moreover, the subjection of Massachusetts ships to a shortage of hands was a serious economic matter, and the episode had far-reaching effects throughout Massachusetts. But the apparent failure of the Hoar's mission actually had some good things come out of it. Many of the people in Concord who had previously not been considered abolitionists or were not concerned with abolitionists or anti-slavery movement now changed their minds. Ralph Waldo Emerson viewed the removal of the Hoars as an act of war by South Carolina. The eviction of the Hoars from South Carolina really kind of marked a turning point in Emerson's engagement with the anti-slavery movement, and it prompted him to become a more vocal critic of Southern actions and use a stronger abolitionist voice. So there's Judge Hoar on the left, and his lovely bride on the right, Sarah, and that is their grave in Sleepy Hollow. After a lifetime of public service, Samuel Hoar died in Concord on November 2nd, 1856. Next slide, please. This is Elizabeth Hoar. Born on July 14th, 1814, she went to school with Henry Thoreau and his siblings. As a young woman of 20, she was engaged to Waldo Emerson's brother Charles, with plans for the couple to live with the Emersons over at Bush. Sadly, Charles died of tuberculosis before the wedding, yet Elizabeth remained a beloved family member with the Emersons for the rest of her life. She took over the household several times when Lydian was ill, and the Emerson children called her Aunt Lizzie. So the section of Bush that was going to belong to her and Charles, she was still living with her family over on Main Street, but she would stay at the Emerson house in that room anytime that she wanted to. Emerson loved her as a sister, and he invited her to join the Transcendental Circle, where she came to know Margaret Fuller, the Alcotts, Ellery Channing, and the Peabody sisters. On a trip to England, she even met Emerson's friend and idol, Thomas Carlyle. She was considered a woman of great intellect by the Transcendental Circle, and she was very close with Margaret Fuller, whose Boston conversations she attended. Hawthorne said that she was, quote, more at home among spirits than among fleshly bodies, while Margaret Fuller remarked that Elizabeth was always seemed to have, quote, an expression of unbroken purity. That first picture she does. As a member of the Transcendental Circle, she prepared copy for The Dial in the early 1840s, and later she assisted Sophia Thoreau and Ellery Channing in collecting Henry Thoreau's posthumous works. She kind of was a muse to all of the Transcendentalists, and she remained close friends with all of them throughout her life. Emerson described her, quote, as a person in whom much culture has not weakened her strength or the delicacy of her native sentiment. In his journal, he wrote of her admirable fairness of mind and added, I think no one who writes or utilizes an opinion can possibly be so fair. He called her Elizabeth the Wise and wrote of her, "I have no other friend I more wish to be immortal than she. She is an influence I cannot spare, but must always have at hand her recourse." Edward Emerson, Waldo's son, wrote of Aunt Lizzie, "Miss Elizabeth Hoar's life was one of beauty and beneficence, and she was an uplifting person to all who had the fortune to come near her. Her sympathies were active and most Catholic, her taste and judgment sure, and her memory for all good things and about people was wonderful. And in that glass all looked fair and interesting. She was the good genius of Concord." Now, according to Emerson's journal, and later used in his eulogy of Thoreau, Elizabeth was reported as saying, "I love Henry Thoreau, but I cannot like him. And as for taking his arm, I should as soon think of taking the arm of an elm tree." Here's one of my favorite little snippets from Bronson Alcott's journal. To me, this is like the perfect Concord day. It's from 1851. This is Bronson. "All the morning was given to conversation in Emerson's study. After dinner, we walked to Walden, and in the evening came Thoreau and Elizabeth Hoar and stayed till 10 o'clock. There was endlessly varied and miscellaneous discourse, which no man may well report." Come on, Bronson, report it. Her brothers, Frisbee and Rockwood, wrote the epitaph, which is on her gravestone in Sleepy Hollow. "Her sympathy with what was high and fair brought her into intimacy with many eminent men and women of the time. Nothing excellent or beautiful escaped her frank apprehension, and in her unfailing memory, precious things lay in exact order as in a royal treasury, hospitably ready to instruct and delight young and old. Her calm courage and simple religious faith triumphed over weakness and pain. And when death transplanted her to her place in the garden of the Lord, he found little perishable to prune away." Next, please. Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff. This is Edward Sherman Hoar. He was, other than Ellery Channing and his brother John, Edward was probably Thoreau's best friend. He was Elizabeth's brother and the third son of Samuel Hoar. Edward was 5.5 years younger than Thoreau, and the two enjoyed hiking through the woods and paddling on the rivers of Concord together. On April 30th, 1844, 182 years ago today, there was a fire in Walden Woods. Edward was 21 years old, was home from his senior year at Harvard for a few days, and was Henry's companion when they inadvertently started a fire that burned 100, 200, 300 acres, I hear different things, of valuable fields and woods, plus 60 stacked cords of wood. So while the respectable citizens of Concord were attending a town meeting, Henry and Edward had rowed up the Sudbury to Fairhaven Bay, where they stopped to cook some chowder made from a fish that they caught. They decided to broil the fish in a pine stump. Why? So we're going to let Henry tell the story. "At the shoemaker's near the river, we obtained a match which we had forgotten. Though it was thus early in the spring, the river was low, for there had not been much rain, and we succeeded in catching a mess of fish sufficient for our dinner before we left the town, and by the shores of Fairhaven Pond we proceeded to cook them. The earth was uncommonly dry, and our fire, kindled far from the woods in a sunny recess in the hillside on the east of the pond, suddenly caught the dry grass of the previous year, which grew about the stump on which it was kindled. We sprang to extinguish it at first with our hands and feet, and then we fought it with a board obtained from the boat. But in a few minutes it was beyond our reach. Being on the side of a hill, it spread rapidly upward through the long, dry, wiry grass, interspersed with bushes. As I ran toward the town through the woods, I could see the smoke over the woods behind me, marking the spot and the progress of the flames. Presently, I heard the sound of the distant bell giving the alarm, and I knew that the town was on its way to the scene. So he decided to sit and just watch the fire. In his journal, he said it was a glorious spectacle. Hitherto, this is all written in 1850, by the way, so like 6 years after the fact. Hitherto, I felt like a guilty person, nothing but shame and regret. But now I settled the matter with myself shortly. I said to myself, who are these men who are said to be the owners of these woods, and how am I related to them? I have set fire to the forest, but I have done no wrong therein, and now it is as if the lightning had done it. These flames are just consuming their natural food. It never troubled me from the day to this more than if the lightning had done it. The trivial fishing was all that disturbed me and disturbs me still. So if he's not so disturbed about it, why is he writing about it 6 years later? Anyway, only Squire Hoar's influence saved them from any prosecution, and he paid the owners of the property for the damage around $2,000. But for many years afterwards, Concord folk viewed Henry Thoreau, and probably Edward with a little suspicion. In Thoreau's journal, he says that he was called a damned rascal and a flibberty gibbet. Not the flibberty gibbet. Soon after the fire, Edward went away to California with a ne'er-do-well, not Henry. But after a short stay, he returned home and completed his undergraduate degree at Harvard. He followed in the footsteps of his father and others in his family and began the study of law at Harvard, but he later earned his law degree from Columbia, and he was admitted to the bar in New York in 1848 when he was 25 years old. But it was reported that he found the confinement of the law office oppressive. So he returned to Concord, and then after that went to join the California Gold Rush. After spending some time panning for gold in California, he set up a law office in San Francisco. And in 1851, he became the first district attorney of Santa Barbara County. But he only had that position for a year, and he did not return to Concord until 1857. His father died in 1856. They were a little bit estranged from each other. But in 1857, that year, he was Thoreau's companion on a trip to Maine. That's memorialized in Thoreau's The Maine Woods, which they traveled 325 miles in a canoe with the Indian guide Joseph Polis. So it was on that excursion with Joe Polis that Thoreau and Polis became separated from Edward. Thoreau completely freaked out by losing his friend. The nearly frantic Thoreau began shouting for him and noticed that Polis's reaction was pretty indifferent about the whole thing. And he showed some unwillingness to exert himself, complaining that he was very tired because he was the one that had been paddling all day. But he went off calling for Edward, Thoreau reports, making a noise like an owl. Thoreau remembered that Hoar was nearsighted, and he feared that Edward had either fallen down a cliff or he had fainted and sucked down some rocks beneath it, and he would recall, I shouted and searched above and below the precipice in the twilight till I could not see, expecting nothing less than to find a body beneath it. For half an hour, I anticipated and believed only the worst. I thought what I should do the next day if I did not find him, what I could do in such a wilderness. So Thoreau's completely freaked out. He's going to have to go back to Concord and tell the royal family of Concord that somehow he had lost their son and he died. They didn't find Hoar that evening, and so they finally bedded down for the night in what Thoreau called the most wild and desolate region he had ever camped in. At the first glimmer of morning, Thoreau was awake, anxious to renew the search for Edward, but Polis, however, was unconcerned, saying that he wanted his breakfast first. Later in the morning, after much searching and yelling and freaking out, they finally found Edward, none the worse for wear, sitting with his feet up, smoking his pipe. In July 1858, the two men spent 17 days together on a botany expedition to the White Mountains, for which Edward bore the cost of the horse and wagon used for the trip. So soon after these excursions with Thoreau, Edward urged his sister Elizabeth to take a trip to Europe because she had always dreamed of going. And in October of 1858, he accompanied her and their next-door neighbor. She was reported as a 37-year-old spinster named Elizabeth Pritchard on an extended tour of Europe. During their stay in Florence, Edward and Miss Pritchard became engaged the day after his 35th birthday. There had been absolutely no previous romantic inclination between the two of them. Concord gossips think it was more of a marriage of convenience than anything else. But regardless, they got married. The problem was, as a married man, he could no longer go running off with his friend Henry whenever he wanted to. Now, apparently, he never practiced law ever again. He and his wife purchased a farm in Lincoln after the birth of their only child, a daughter whom they named Florence, because that's where they got married. And later, they also lived in Europe for a short time. On his death, Thoreau willed about 100 of his specimens of grasses and sedges to Edward. And although he withdrew from the legal profession and avoided public life, Edward threw himself into scientific study, geology, natural history, and botany. He was also a great reader and a lover of art, music, and drama. He was a follower of politics, which he approached, quote, from a liberal point of view. He was associated with important contemporary observers of the natural world. He was friends with Louis Agassiz and William Brewster. He suffered from rheumatism later in his life, and he also may have had tuberculosis. And he died in Washington, D.C., where he had gone in an effort to improve his health on February 2nd, 1893, at the age of 69. After his death, Florence presented her father's collection of 1,000 plant specimens to the New England Botanical Club, which included those that Thoreau had given him. Now they are all part of the University of Connecticut Herbarium. Next slide, please. That's where they set the fire. Henry's right. It turned up just fine. Look at it. This is a great little quote about Edward. He cared nothing for wealth or fame. His rare genius might easily have won, but his car knew the song of all birds. His eye saw the beauty of flowers and the secret of their life. His unerring taste delighted in what was best in himself. So his pure and quiet days reaped their rich harvest of wisdom and content. Next, please. Edward looking studious in his grave over in Sleepy Hollow. Next slide, please. Ebenezer Rockwood Hoar. 1816 to 1895, the son of Samuel Hoar, was a U.S. congressman, anti-slavery activist, Massachusetts Supreme Court judge, U.S. Attorney General under President Grant. Often referred to as Judge Hoar or just Rockwood, he procured the bronze for the Minuteman statue by introducing legislation in Congress that provided 10 decommissioned Civil War cannon to be melted down for the bronze. He also saved Wright's Tavern. Fearing that the building would be destroyed or used as a, quote, disreputable drinking establishment, we can't have that in Concord, he and Reuben Rice purchased it in 1885 or 1886 and donated it to First Parish Church, who still owns the building. He chaired the committee for the 1875 centennial celebration of the Battle of Concord, and he utilized his close ties, he was the Attorney General, with President Grant to secure Grant's attendance for the 100th anniversary on April 19th, 1875. By the way, when Grant came to the area for the centennial in 1875, it should be noted, he came to Concord first before he went to Lexington. Just saying. And also, he was late getting to Lexington because of all the traffic trying to get there. So members of Grant and members of his cabinet came to Concord. They stayed for a couple of days, and they stayed at his house, at Rockwood's house over on Main Street in Concord. So he was a conservative Republican, and he disapproved of the agitator methods of people like Wendell Phillips and other abolitionists. Oh, by the way, that's them in front of his house. President Grant is there in the middle. Next slide, please. So he didn't like abolitionists who were loud and who were agitators and always seemed to be causing trouble. He's an abolitionist. He just doesn't like the people who seem to be always yelling and screaming. So he disapproved of, particularly of Wendell Phillips' harsh attacks on people like Abraham Lincoln. And in fact, there was more than once Phillips made bitter attacks on Hoar during their political battles. The animosity was so significant that after Wendell Phillips died in February of 1884, a distinguished gentleman of Cambridge asked Hoar if he planned to attend the funeral. Hoar replied, "No, I am not invited, but I approve of it heartily." He was not a candidate for re-election in 1875. He returned to Concord and resumed the practice of law until his death in 1895 at the age of 78. Next, please. His epitaph reads, "Leader at the bar, invincible champion in a righteous cause, judge who added clearness and stability to the law, a statesman who sacrificed personal ambition to resist corrupt men, ardent lover of Concord, given high example of public spirit, fond of life and home with simple faith and serene hope, fearless of death." Next, George Frisbee Hoar. Next. I love these pictures of, you never think of George Frisbee Hoar being a younger guy. And here he is. So August 29th of this year will be his 200th birthday. We need a party. Get on that, Rob, William. The son of Samuel, he became a U.S. Senator and was a key figure in Massachusetts politics. A prominent U.S. Senator known for his integrity, he was an abolitionist and a radical Republican. He regarded slavery as immoral and was raised in a household which actively opposed racial bigotry and often defied laws they deemed unjust. Being the radical Republican that he was, he strongly opposed the Democratic Party, and he called it the party of the saloon keeper, the ballot box stuffer, and Klansman. As a young man, he studied for several months at the boarding school in Waltham, run by Samuel and Sarah Alden Bradford Ripley. He graduated from Harvard in 1846 at the age of 20 and earned his law degree at Harvard Law in 1849. He was admitted to the bar and he settled in Worcester, where he practiced law for 20 years. Initially a member of the Free Soil Party, he joined the Republican Party after its founding in 1854. First elected to public office at the age of 25, he served in the Massachusetts State Legislature and was elected to the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1852, to the Massachusetts Senate in 1857. He represented Massachusetts as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives for 4 terms, from 1869 to 1877. And then he was a Massachusetts senator until his death in 1904. He served 5 terms. He was considered a man of extraordinary intellect, involved in issues including civil rights, women's suffrage, and antitrust laws. In fact, he co-authored the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. He also worked tirelessly but unsuccessfully to obtain a floor vote for a bill to protect young voting rights for African American men in 1891. He was an ardent anti-imperialist, and he spoke out against the acquisition and occupation of the Philippine Islands after the Spanish-American War. He was a regent of the Smithsonian Institute. He was active in the American Historical Association and was one of the founders of the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and he was a president of that organization. He's listed among the founders of what would become Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and his statue is seated outside of the Worcester City Hall. A lifelong opponent of slavery, he was a protege and a good friend of Charles Sumner. Next slide, please. There they are. Like Sumner, he was a staunch defender of black civil and political rights during Reconstruction. He argued in the Senate in favor of women's suffrage as early as 1886. He was one of only 7 senators to vote against the Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887, which abolished women's suffrage in Utah after it had been a territorial right since 1870. Now, a little bit of history. A massive influx of Chinese immigrants arrived in the U.S. during the mid-19th century, driven by the California Gold Rush and the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Between 1849 and 1882, approximately 300,000 Chinese workers entered the U.S., mostly settling in California for mining, railroad, and agricultural work. The population was overwhelmingly male. It was like a 20-to-1 ratio of men to Chinese women. And many of the workers came here on 5-year contracts. As their numbers increased, should be no surprise, anti-Chinese sentiment in California grew among white workers, leading to violence, segregation, and state-levied taxes against the Chinese. The Page Act of 1875 banned Chinese women from entering the United States to prevent families from coming to the United States. But they continued to allow Chinese men to come here for labor. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a federal law signed by President Chester A. Arthur prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. It did make exceptions for travelers and diplomats, but the act also denied Chinese residents already in the U.S. from becoming citizens, and any Chinese people traveling in or out of the country were required to carry a special certificate identifying their status, or they would be deported. That could never happen today. It was the first major U.S. law implemented to prevent all members of a specific national group from coming to the United States. It was supposed to be for only 10 years, but it was renewed and strengthened in 1892, and it was made permanent in 1902. It remained in force until 1943 with the Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act. Now, even though it was repealed, the act also said that only 105 Chinese people could come to the United States every year. So it completely curtailed how many could come. Chinese immigration later increased with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952, which abolished direct racial barriers, and then in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act opened up the doors to everybody. So why am I talking about this? When the Chinese Exclusion Act was being debated and voted on in Congress, George Frisbee Hoar was the only senator to vote against it. That deserves applause, I think. His unswavering opposition to the act was in line with his anti-racism that he had long done for Native Americans and African Americans. It also was in touch with his anti-nativism and his opposition to American imperialism. He said at the time, "The advocates of this legislation appeal to a twofold motive for its support. First, they invoke the old race prejudice which has so often played its hateful and bloody part in our history. Second, they say that the Chinese laborer works cheap and lives cheap, and so injures the American laborer with whom he competes, which he knew was BS." Quote, "The old race prejudice, ever fruitful of crime and of folly, has not been confined to monarchies or to the Dark Ages. Our own republic and our own generation have yielded to this delusion and have paid the terrible penalty." Hoar called the Chinese Exclusion Act nothing less than the legalization of racial discrimination. After a lifetime of service, George Frisbee Hoar died on September 30th, 1904. He was 78 years old. So Ida Tarbell was a muckraking journalist, and she was well acquainted with George Frisbee Hoar. She said this of him: "He embodied all the virtues of the classic New Englander and few of the vices. His loyalty was granite-ribbed. He revered the Constitution and all the institutions born and reared under it. He was proud of the United States, but his heart belonged to Massachusetts. In his mouth, that name took on a beauty and an emotion which never ceased to stir me, Westerner that I was. Combined with his patriotic loyalties was a passionate devotion to classic literature, Greek, Roman, English. He knew the words of Homer and Virgil, as well as the greatest of the early English writers. And not infrequently at our Sunday morning breakfasts, he would repeat long passages. Earning money is hateful to me, he said. Never in all my life before have I undertaken a thing I did not want to do simply for money. Some things I like to do, believe that I can do better than I could do anything else. I never was such a donkey before. There are so many things I long to do. One of them is to learn Italian well enough to read Dante and Boccaccio in the original. And I want to commit Homer to memory. I would like to have my head packed with Greek." Next, please. Just some of the cartoons. This is actually an ad for washing machines. American-made washing machines, of course. Next, please. Americans were quite happy about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Next, please. So every year, I keep talking about Rob because he's a big fan. He created the George Frisbee Hoar Appreciation Society. And when he was teaching at Fenn every year, he would bring his students out to celebrate George Frisbee Hoar's birthday. And was it the Chinese American Club that would come out as well, Rob? They would come out from Boston every year, and they would celebrate George Frisbee Hoar's birthday because of his being the lone vote. If you look in the back there, there's Rob and I in the back. So George Frisbee Hoar is certainly not forgotten by the Chinese Americans in Boston. Next, please. And then next, please. There he is in Worcester. Next, please. More pictures of his grave. And then next, please. That's on the back of his sarcophagus. And then next, please. There are so many stories about the Hoar family and their connection to not only Concord history, but American history in general. I could have talked about any one of these people for about 3 hours. Now, we all know, of course, they were called the royal family of Concord, but it's not because of their wealth, but because of their constant presence in town, state, and national leadership. Again, they were in advance of the times in which they lived. They were leaders to a higher and better sphere, both in social and political sense. The Hoars truly were the conscience of their community. And while Thoreau, Emerson, Hawthorne, and the Alcotts defined Concord's literary soul, the Hoar family defined our town's moral and political backbone, not just in their time, but also in our time, and hopefully for centuries to come. Thank you very much.
very much, Richard. So, does anyone have any questions for Richard? Then, all right. Just hang on, I'll bring him back.
Hi, Richard. Christopher Childs. We have Henry David Thoreau in common.
We do.
As you know, there is a quote from Elizabeth Hoar describing Waldo, as well as I think anybody ever did. I'm hoping you know it better than I do. She described him as meeting people as if he expected always to gain more from them than they could from him. Are you familiar with that?
I would have to paraphrase it as well, and I think I'm familiar with that, but you did it as well as I could. But yeah, there are a lot of people who talk about Mr. Emerson seeming to, he didn't act like he was above them. There was a famous, he gave a lecture out west somewhere, and there was a woman who said that she didn't understand what he said, but she liked the idea that he didn't act like he was better than everybody else. And everybody seemed to get that impression from Mr. Emerson. He's the star of Concord, but he seemed like, at least to some, like a really down-home guy. And certainly he and all the Emersons and Elizabeth were incredibly, incredibly close. Needless to say, she never married after Charles died. And so she was like a sister and just a regular family member for her entire life.
It's my recollection that there was a Hoar who was very involved in the creation of the national park in Acadia. Is that part of this family as well, do you know?
That's a good question. I know that the Hoars were instrumental in getting Great Meadows created as a park. So they were involved with that. But as for Arcadia, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. Oh, okay. Oh, the National Parks documentary, sure. I wouldn't be surprised.
Hi, I'm going to read two questions from our chat.
Okay.
So the first one is submitted by Samuel Hoar Jr., his great-great-great-grandson. And he said, you refer repeatedly to Squire Hoar as Judge Hoar. Others have done the same, yet I have found no record of his ever having served on any bench. What is the derivation of this appellation?
I think Squire was just a term of respect. It's funny because a lot of times when you see Emerson and Thoreau giving lectures, they're always referred to as Ralph Waldo Emerson Esquire or Henry David Thoreau Esquire, which of course they weren't lawyers either. I think it's more of just a term of respect than anything else.
Okay, and the second one is from Doug Baker. Who was the widow Hoar that lived in number 1 Church Green on church property in the 19th century?
That's a good question. I do not know.
All right.
Sorry, Doug.
We stumped the expert.
Now I have homework to do. Thanks.
Anyone else?
No, it's, when I started researching this, there's so many of them. And for a long time, I kind of had a little cheat sheet that I had tried to figure out who was married to who and who was the son of whom, and there's a lot of them. Yes.
Hi, I'm from Needham, Massachusetts, but I'm also the great-great-grandson of George Frisbee Hoar, Reginald Foster.
Nice.
And great presentation. I have, there's about a half a dozen other things that could be mentioned. Like you said,
Absolutely.
You only have so much time. I struggle, I admire very much what not only my great-great-great-grandfather did, and of course 4 greats ago was Roger Sherman, actually signed all 4 of the original constitutional
Right.
documents, the only gentleman who ever did that. But I struggle to explain to people today who this family was or my great-great-grandfather is, and who would you compare either the family or George Frisbee Hoar to today? What politician or leader in the country in the last 20 or 50 years would you compare them to?
I'd compare them.
I try to explain them.
I'd compare them to the Kennedys. So, the Kennedys had so many social activists and politicians and senators, and I feel like they were kind of like the forerunner of the Kennedys, maybe the Bushes, but sorry, but but maybe I would say the Kennedys. They were the 19th century version of the Kennedys, I think. Certainly not. No, absolutely not. Do we have anybody radical and progressive?
Can you raise your hand so I can give you the mic so that the people on Zoom can hear you?
I don't know. Do we have anybody radical and progressive in Congress that's a family that has a dynasty like this?
Sorry, the question I'm sorry, I violated the protocol. The Kennedys are not as progressive or radical as the Hoars were in the 19th century.
True.
Particularly Senator Hoar. And
Right.
who in the 20th or the 21st century, not royalty, a royal family, carries that banner or beacon, if anybody.
Good question.
And the Kennedys were Irish.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's any kind of a family like that. Well, certainly Bernie Sanders, but I consider Bernie Sanders is more of a Eugene Debs character than a Kennedy dynasty. So yeah, I don't know if such a creature exists anymore. Are there even any family dynasties in politics like there used to be? I think a lot of the younger generations are like, I don't want part of that. I mean, would anybody in their right mind go into any of that? The Hoars were interesting because every one of them, they're putting their personal reputations on the line by standing up against stuff that were not popular. Certainly with John Hoar trying to protect the Nipmucks during King Philip's War. Even radical Republicans, even though they controlled Congress during the Civil War, the really diehard radical Republicans who were complete abolitionists, they weren't very popular. So a lot of these folks, a lot of the Hoars are definitely putting their reputation on the line and doing what they thought right, regardless of what people thought of them. To be the only senator to vote against the Chinese Exclusion Act, to me, that's one of the greatest moments in congressional history. So maybe say they're like the Kennedys, but more progressive or more radical. That's as close as I can come to somebody like that.
Round of applause for Victor and all the work he does for this group. I had dinner this evening with a British gentleman and his wife, and he said something about a very famous person with that last name, H-O-A-R, in England before that particular branch came over here to Concord. Do you know anything about the history of the Hoar family in Britain just before they came over here in the 1600s?
The research that I've done, I just know enough about John Hoar's dad, who was a sheriff, and he was born in Gloucester, England. And so I think that they were probably in Gloucester, England before they came here. But I don't know much about them, to tell you the truth.
Hi.
Hi.
Wonder if we could go back to the previous slide, and if you would allow me to speak what's on George Frisbee Hoar's grave.
Feel free.
This is his grave in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. It is not to be missed. It's behind the Alcotts and the Thoreaus, down the hill a little bit. You can see it almost from the Alcott's grave. And a larger version of this speech is on that statue in Worcester next to City Hall. I have no faith in fatalism, in destiny, in blind force. I believe in God, the living God. I believe in the American people, a free and brave people who do not bow the neck or bend the knee to any other, and who desire no other to bow the neck or bend the knee to them. I believe that a republic is greater than an empire. I believe, finally, whatever clouds may darken the horizon, that the world is growing better, that today is better than yesterday, and that tomorrow will be better than today. Thank you, George Frisbee Hoar.
Are there any more questions online?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Curran.
Okay. So Caroline says, thank you so much for this fantastic talk. Could Richard speak a bit to Ebenezer Rockwood Hoar's reaction to Concord women voting for the first time on March 29, 1880, and what he thought of women's suffrage more broadly?
I believe he was the judge that was there that day. And when Bronson Alcott said that, so the women were allowed to vote in Massachusetts if they could vote, if it was an issue that had to do with children or schools. So the first woman to register to vote in Concord was Louisa May Alcott. What a shock. And so she got 15 or 16 other women to go vote that day. They had the town meeting. Bronson Alcott stood up and said, in honor of this auspicious occasion, we should let the women vote first. And I believe it was Judge Hoar who said, absolutely. The women got up and cast their votes. They did the audacious deed, as Louisa would say. They sat down, and then the judge said, okay, polls are closed. So the men were not allowed to vote for that. And Louisa said that when they came out of the meeting house, the earth was not ripped asunder, the skies did not open, and she said that we made the men said, well, what if they didn't elect a good school council? And the judge said, they elected a good school council, relax. So it was Judge Hoar was involved with that. So.
Thank you very much, Richard.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And thank you all for... So thank you for joining us and for your thoughtful questions. But the fun is not over. Please join us for the reception and book sale and signing downstairs in the Parish Hall.